The divorce papers had been ready for 3 months before she used them. This was the specific quality of Vivian's preparation, which was the quality she had developed across 5 years of living with a man who believed that patience was weakness. She had learned, inside his contempt, that patience was the only weapon that could not be taken from her. She had waited. She had waited while the solicitor completed the audit of her family's land deeds, which had taken 4 months of careful investigation through the specific archives that held the records of properties transferred during the bankruptcy proceedings that had preceded her marriage and that had been transferred, Thomas had discovered, through mechanisms that were not entirely clean. She had waited while the legal proceedings were organized, the specific patient machinery of property law that moved slowly and irrevocably and that did not care about the pride of the man whose interests were being quietly dismantled. She had waited while the townhouse in Mayfair was arranged, furnished, staffed, made ready for a woman who was going to arrive without announcement. She had waited through 17 specific occasions across the 5 years when Julian had deployed his specific weapon of choice, which was not shouting, and was not striking, and was not any form of cruelty that left visible evidence, but the particular quiet cruelty of a man who used the fact of what he had done for you as a cage. "Remember where I found you, Vivian." This was the specific phrase he returned to, with the consistency of someone who had found an instrument that worked and who had seen no reason to develop additional instruments. "You were a penniless girl from a ruined house. I did you a favor by putting my ring on your finger." She had heard this 17 times across 5 years. The first time, she had wept. The second time, she had tried to respond, to explain that her value was not determined by what she had owned when they married. The third time, she had understood that responding was not available to her as an instrument, because responding required him to engage, and engagement required him to acknowledge her as a person whose perspective was relevant, and he had organized his understanding of her in a way that did not include this acknowledgement. She had gone quiet, not the silence of defeat, the silence of someone who had turned her attention away from the unwinnable engagement and toward the question of what was actually available to her. But before we go to the library, before we stand in the doorway of a room full of the realm's most powerful investors and watch a woman in a traveling suit walk calmly to the head of the mahogany table, I need to ask you something. If someone had spent 5 years telling you that you were nothing without them, and you had spent those 5 years quietly building the proof that they were wrong, would you confront them privately, where no one would witness the correction, or would you choose the room? Drop your answer in the comments. Because Vivian chose the room. She chose it specifically. She had thought about it for 3 months, and she had concluded that the room was the only venue that would make what happened irreversible. Julian had signed her divorce papers in front of the realm's wealthiest investors. He had signed them to save his pride. He had signed them to prove she meant nothing. He had not read them. Subscribe and hit the bell. And tell me where you are watching from tonight. Your city, your country. Let me know who is in the room. Now, let's begin. She had married Julian at 22, which was the age at which her father's bankruptcy had been finalized, and at which the specific calculation of her family's situation had produced, through the particular social machinery of aristocratic financial rescue, the marriage. Her father had not forced her. This was the specific honest accounting she had done many times, and which she returned to when she needed clarity. Her father had not forced her. He had been devastated by his financial situation, had been a man who loved his daughter, and who had found himself in a position where his love for her and his desperation for the family were pulling in the same direction, and he had presented the option to her with the specific careful quality of a man trying to tell the truth about what was at stake, while also trying not to be the person who trapped her. She had said yes. She had said yes because she had assessed the available options with the clear eyes of a 22-year-old who had been managing her family's domestic situation for 2 years since her mother's death, and who understood the specific weight of what her father was carrying, and who had decided that the weight was not something she was going to make him carry alone. She had also said yes because Julian had been, in the period before the marriage, in the specific courtship period that had the quality of all courtship periods for men of his kind, which was the quality of a performance organized for an audience. He had been charming, attentive, the specific version of himself that he deployed when he wanted something. He had wanted her. Not her as a person, she would understand later. Her as a symbol, the daughter of a noble house restored to solvency through his intervention. The specific narrative of a powerful man making a generous match that communicated something about his character to the social world that he cared about. She had been an acquisition. She had not understood this at 22. She had understood it at 23, in the first months of the marriage, when the performance had been set aside because the performance was no longer necessary, and what remained was Julian without the audience, which was a man who was fundamentally uninterested in her as a person, and who had organized the marriage around the use it provided him, rather than the partnership it was supposed to represent. She had tried. She had tried with the specific earnest quality of a woman who had made a commitment and who believed commitments were worth honoring, who had thought that the warmth she had seen in the courtship was real and was simply waiting for the correct conditions to return, who had believed for the better part of a year that she was doing something wrong that could be corrected. She had cooked the specific meals he had mentioned preferring. She had organized the household with the thoroughness that would relieve him of any domestic concern. She had attended his social obligations with the quality of a duchess whose presence reflected well on her husband. She had asked, gently and in private, for his time, for the specific, ordinary intimacy of a marriage, conversation, shared evenings, the basic acknowledgement that they were two people who had chosen each other. He had given her the phrase, "Remember where I found you." She had understood, in the third year, that she was not doing anything wrong. She was simply not the person he had wanted to acquire. She was the thing he had acquired, which was different, and which did not have needs that he considered relevant to his own experience of the marriage. She had stopped trying. She had started planning. Thomas Aldrich had been recommended to her through the specific channel of her cousin Eleanor, who was the only member of her family she had maintained genuine contact with across the 5 years. Julian had not liked Eleanor, had found her directness inconvenient, and had managed Vivienne's relationship with her with the subtle restriction of a man who did not forbid things directly, but made them costly through the specific cold displeasure that followed. Vivienne had maintained the relationship anyway. Eleanor had known a solicitor. The Crown's most respected legal mind, she had said, which was the description that came with the name in all circles that discussed him. Sharp, honorable, not interested in the specific social games that connected most solicitors to the network of powerful men whose interests they primarily served. She had written to him in October. He had come to the estate in the specific capacity of a solicitor, consulted on a matter of estate management, which was the framing she had used with Julian's household, and Julian had not thought to question it, because Julian did not think of her as someone who would have reasons to consult a solicitor that were not connected to his own affairs. Thomas had sat across from her in the morning room, and she had told him what she needed. She had been precise and calm, and had delivered the information with the quality she brought to all things she needed to be precise about, and she had watched him receive it with the specific attending quality of a man who was processing both the information and something additional that she had noticed but had not addressed. He had asked her several questions. They had been the right questions, not the questions of a man who was performing competence, but the questions of someone who was actually thinking through the problem and who wanted specific information to think with. She had answered each one. He had said he would need several months. She had said she had time. He had looked at her when she said it, with the specific quality of a man receiving a piece of information about someone that reorganized his understanding of them, and she had understood what he had received, the specific information that her patience was not passivity, that the time she had was not the time of someone waiting to be rescued, but the time of someone who had organized herself to wait and was using the waiting. He had come back every 3 weeks. Each visit had the professional framing. Each visit had also developed, across the months, the specific additional quality that professional visits sometimes developed when the people in them were paying attention to each other. She had not addressed it. She had been focused on the work. But she had noted it, which was the honest accounting. She had noted it with the specific quality of a woman who had not been seen by the man she was married to for 5 years, and who was finding, across the 3-week visits, that being seen was doing something to the careful management of her interior life that she was going to need to examine eventually. She had not examined it yet. She had needed to finish the work first. The business summit had been planned for 6 months, which was the length of time Julian organized his significant events, and which she had known about for those same 6 months, through the specific ordinary knowledge of a duchess who managed the domestic and social calendar of a grand estate. She had known the date. She had chosen it. Not because she needed the audience, specifically, the legal proceedings would have proceeded regardless of witnesses, but because she had understood, after 5 years of living with Julian, that the specific instrument he was most vulnerable to was public diminishment of the image he had spent his life constructing. He had used her compliance as evidence of his power. He would sign her divorce papers as evidence of his indifference. He would not read them first, because reading them would communicate that they contained something worth reading, which would communicate that she had prepared something, which would communicate that she had agency, which he was not going to communicate in front of the realm's wealthiest investors. She had known this. She had built this. The morning of the summit, she had dressed with the specific care she brought to things that mattered. The traveling suit was not the rich, elaborate gown of a duchess at a formal occasion. It was the precise, well-made garment of a woman who was going somewhere and who had dressed for the journey rather than for the room she was leaving. It communicated competence. It communicated motion. It communicated that the wearing of it was a decision made by someone who knew what came next. She had looked at herself in the mirror. She had thought about 5 years. She had thought about 22-year-old Vivienne, who had said yes for the right reasons, and who had found, on the other side of the yes, a specific kind of isolation that was harder to name than the obvious cruelties because it was invisible to everyone who was not inside it. She had thought about the phrase, "You were a penniless girl from a ruined house. I did you a favor." She had thought about Thomas, who had looked at her across the morning room table in October and had asked the right questions, and who had come back every 3 weeks, and who had looked at her with the specific quality that she had been not examining for 8 months. She had examined it recently. She had understood what she had been not examining. She had thought about what it meant to be seen. She had picked up the divorce papers. She had walked downstairs. She had walked to the library. The doors had opened under her hands with the specific quality of doors that were heavier than ordinary doors, because they were built to communicate the importance of what was behind them. The room had the quality she had expected, the mahogany table with 12 investors arranged around it, the specific quality of a significant business meeting at its most formal and therefore most valuable moment, the particular atmosphere of a room where considerable money was being organized, Julian at the head. She had walked past the investors without looking at them, which was the specific choice she had made, not arrogance, but the deliberate communication of a woman who had a destination and who was not distracted by the room. She had stopped at the head of the table. She had placed the papers in front of her husband. Julian's face had done its sequence, the shock arriving first, because he had not planned for this, and Julian did not manage situations he had not planned for well. And then the second thing, which was the rapid calculation of a man who was in a room full of witnesses and who was assessing what response would cost him the least in front of those witnesses. She had watched him calculate. "Forgive the interruption, gentlemen," she had said. Her voice had the carrying quality of someone who was not performing confidence but simply had it. "Your Grace," she said, looking at Julian, "these are official divorce papers. I am leaving you. Sign them." He had laughed. She had expected the laugh. It was the specific laugh of a man who was deploying the instrument of contempt in front of an audience, the laugh that communicated that she was a source of amusement rather than a person making a serious demand, the laugh that communicated that his confidence was so complete and her threat so negligible that the appropriate response was amusement. She had waited for it to finish. "You think you can survive a day without my gold, woman?" The room had the quality of people who were not certain what they were witnessing, but who were paying close attention. "Fine," he said. "Let us see how fast you crawl back to my gates." He had signed. She had watched him sign without reading, the specific flourish of a man who was communicating to the room that the document was beneath his attention. He had thrown the pen. She had picked up the papers. She had walked to the door. She had not looked back. She had heard, behind her, the specific quality of a room that was beginning to process what had just happened, and she had understood, from the quality of the processing, that the room was going to have questions for Julian, that he was not going to enjoy answering. She had walked out of the estate. The carriage had been waiting. Thomas had organized the carriage. The townhouse in Mayfair had the specific quality of something chosen for its own virtues, rather than for the statement it made. It was not grand. It was well proportioned. The rooms the right size for living in, rather than for displaying. The light coming through the windows at the angles that made rooms feel inhabited. She had stood in the entrance hall on the first evening, and she had felt, for the first time in 5 years, the specific quality of a space that was organized around her, rather than around the management of someone else's needs. She had been very still. Not sad. She had been honest with herself about this, which was the honest accounting of a woman who had made peace with the shape of the 5 years before she executed the exit, who had not left anything unexamined in the months of preparation. She was not sad. She was something more complicated, which was the specific quality of someone who has set down a weight that was real and necessary and that they are glad to be done with, while also acknowledging that the carrying of the weight was part of their history and that the history was part of them. She had been still with this for a while. Then she had unpacked. The unpacking had the quality of an ordinary necessary thing, done with the particular attention you gave to ordinary necessary things when the ordinary things were finally yours. The weeks that followed had the specific quality of a life being learned, not rebuilt. She had not lost herself in the 5 years, had been careful about this, with the specific fierceness of a woman who understood that herself was the thing most worth protecting, and who had protected it. But there were things she had not been doing, things she had managed down or set aside or not permitted herself to want, because the wanting required a presence she was not prepared to give Julian access to. She was learning how to want things again. She went to the museums she had been meaning to visit. She had the conversations she had been wanting to have with Eleanor, who came to the townhouse for dinner twice in the first month, with the specific warm directness that Julian had found inconvenient, and whose presence Vivian received with the specific quality of someone who had been missing something, and who was now receiving it. She walked in the park. Thomas came to the townhouse on the second week, which was the professional visit, to review the completion of the land deed proceedings, the final documentation, the legal confirmation that the properties were hers, the specific organized completion of the work they had been doing for 8 months. He had come with papers. He had also come with the quality she had been noting and examining, and that she was no longer managing at the careful distance she had been maintaining. She had offered him tea. He had sat across from her at the morning room table, which was the specific table at which they had been sitting for 8 months, and they had done the work, which had taken an hour, and then the work was done, and the papers were organized, and the professional occasion had reached its natural conclusion. Neither of them had left. She had looked at him. He had been looking at her with the quality she had been noting since October, which was not the professional attending quality but the other kind, the specific looking of a man who had spent 8 months paying attention to someone and who was no longer in a context that required him to manage what the attention communicated. Vivienne, he said. She had found, in the specific moment of hearing her name from him in that register, that 8 months of careful not examining had not actually prevented what happened during the 8 months from happening. It had simply deferred the understanding of it. She understood it now. Thomas, she said. He was quiet for a moment. The papers are complete, he said. Yes, she said. The property is entirely secured, he said. Yes, she said. There is nothing further that our professional arrangement requires, he said. No, she said. Neither of them had said anything for a moment. There is something that our arrangement has produced, he said, that is not professional. She had looked at him with the clear eyes she brought to things she was ready to see. Yes, she said. I am aware of the timing, he said. I am aware that you have just left a significant situation and that the appropriate response to the timing would be patience. I am prepared to provide patience in whatever quantity the situation requires. She had thought about what he was offering, which was the specific offer of a man who had organized himself around her needs rather than around his own, and who was doing it naturally, which was different from doing it strategically. How long, she said, have you felt this? He was quiet for a moment. Since the second visit, he said. When you described what the 5 years had been, and you described it with the quality of someone who had already made peace with it, who was not asking for my sympathy, but simply providing context, so I could do the work correctly. He looked at his hands. You were the most clear-eyed person I had ever sat across from. She had sat with this. I spent 8 months, she said, not examining something I was aware of, because the examining would have interfered with the work. He looked at her. Yes, he said. The work is done, she said. Yes, he said. I have had, she said carefully, a great deal of experience with a man who did not see me, who organized our entire arrangement around what I represented to him, rather than who I was. She looked at the morning room table. I am not interested in moving from one arrangement to another, simply because the new arrangement offers better terms. He was very still. What would you be interested in? He said. She had thought about this. Time, she said. The specific, ordinary time of getting to know someone. Walks and conversations, and the particular quality of spending time with someone who is interested in the same things I am interested in, without the timeline of an arrangement. He had looked at her with the attending quality. "Yes," he said. "That is exactly what I would like." The walks had begun the following week. They walked in the park nearest the townhouse, with the specific quality of two people who were not performing anything. Not performing romance, not performing professional neutrality, simply present with each other in the particular way of people who were discovering that the other person was worth being present with. He knew a great deal. Not the performance of knowledge, the actual accumulated understanding of someone who had been reading widely and thinking seriously for 35 years, and who had developed, from the reading and the thinking, the specific opinions of someone who had engaged with ideas rather than simply acquired them. She had opinions of her own. This was the discovery that surprised her most, not about him, but about herself. She had opinions that she had not been expressing because 5 years of having opinions treated as inconveniences had produced the specific self-management of a woman who had learned to keep her opinions in the category of things she held privately. With Thomas, she expressed them. He received them with the quality she had first noted in October, which was the quality of genuine interest, not the performed interest of a man being polite to a woman whose opinions he would have preferred she manage privately, but the actual interest of someone who found what she thought worth thinking about. They disagreed sometimes. This was its own specific discovery. The first time she had said something that he pushed back on, she had felt the specific bracing quality of someone who had been conditioned to expect that her perspective being questioned was the prelude to dismissal. He had not dismissed, he had simply engaged, with the quality of someone who was interested in the truth of the matter rather than in being right about it, and she had found herself engaging back, and they had arrived at something more nuanced than either of them had started with. She had felt, walking home from the park that day, the specific quality of someone who is discovering that their mind is a resource that other people find valuable and who has not had occasion to make this discovery for some time. She was also, she acknowledged in the honest accounting, falling in love. Not in the specific way she had believed herself to be falling in love at 22, which had been the particular susceptibility of a young woman encountering what appeared to be warmth from a powerful man in a situation where warmth was what she needed. This was different, slower, built on actual knowledge, the specific accumulation of 8 months of working alongside him and 3 months of learning him as a person, the understanding that what she was feeling was organized around who he actually was, rather than who she had needed someone to be. She was being careful, not because she doubted what she felt. She had always been honest with herself about what she felt, but because care was what the moment required, and she had learned, across 5 years, the specific difference between care and delay, and this was care. Julian's investigator had found her in the 4th week. She had known there would be an investigator. She had told Thomas there would be one when they first discussed the exit, and he had looked at her with the professional attending quality and had said, simply, yes, and had ensured that what would be found was accurate. She was living in the townhouse. She was walking in the park. She was happy, visibly, specifically, in the way that the investigator's report would capture, and that Julian would find more difficult to absorb than anything else in it. Julian had arrived at Thomas's offices on a Wednesday. She had been in the study reviewing a legal matter that Thomas had wanted her input on when she heard the outer door. The specific quality of a door opened without the courtesy of a knock, which was the particular quality of a man who had spent his life in spaces where he did not need to knock. She had recognized it. She had looked at Thomas. He had looked at her. She had taken a breath. She had stood. She had opened the study door into the corridor just as Julian came around the corner, and his face had done the specific sequence that she had not seen in 5 years of marriage. The shock of genuine surprise, because she had not been where he expected her to be, which was begging at his door. She had been here, standing in a solicitor's office in Mayfair, in the morning light, with the composed quality of someone who was entirely at home. "Is this your game, Vivian?" His voice had the quality she had heard many times, and that had a different effect on her now than it had had in the years of the marriage. Not the flinching quality, not the specific bracing quality of someone managing the prelude to the phrase. The quality of something that was no longer in possession of the instrument it had been using. The instrument had been her dependence. She was not dependent. "You used my signed papers to run straight into the bed of your solicitor." She had let him speak. She had let the specific quality of his fury arrive and organize itself into the words it had organized itself into, and she had stood in the corridor, and she had been entirely still, which was the stillness she had developed. Not the stillness of fear, the stillness of someone who had decided not to be moved. Thomas had come to the study doorway. He had placed his hand on her waist, not possessively, with the specific quality of presence, the communication of someone saying, "I am here, you are not alone, what you are standing in front of is not the thing that defines your situation. Tell me you don't love this man." Julian's voice had the quality of desperation that she had not heard from him before, which was the specific desperation of a man who had organized his entire understanding of a situation around a certainty that was no longer available to him. He had been certain she would fail. She had not failed. He had been certain she would return. She had not returned. He had been certain that the divorce was a performance, that the papers were a ploy, that the walking away was the preamble to the crawling back that he had always expected. She had not crawled back. She had walked forward. She looked at him. She had thought, across the months of preparation, about this moment, not obsessively, not with the specific revenge energy of someone who was building toward a confrontation, but the honest thinking of a woman who understood that this moment would come and who had wanted to know, before it arrived, what she wanted to say in it. She wanted to say the truth, not as a weapon, as the specific final accounting of something that deserved to be accounted for completely. She had been precise. "You spent 5 years telling me you did me a favor by marrying me," she said. Her voice had the quality she had been developing across 8 months of knowing what came next. Not cold, not warm, simply true. The specific quality of something that was being said because it was true and because it deserved to be said. "You starved me of affection because you thought I was a captive with no choices." Julian's hands had stilled. She had watched the stilling with the attending quality. But Thomas looked at me and saw a queen. She had felt Thomas's hand on her waist with the quality of something that confirmed, rather than required. "He didn't just free me from your cage." She held Julian's gaze with the clear eyes she had been developing since 23, the eyes of a woman who had looked honestly at her situation and who was looking honestly at this one. "He gave me his heart." A pause. "And yes, Julian, I love him with every ounce of my soul." Julian's face had done something she had not seen it do before, which was the face of a man who had just understood the full dimensions of what he had lost, and who was understanding it not as the loss of an acquisition, but as the loss of something real, the specific face of someone who had devalued a thing so thoroughly that they had not understood its value until it was no longer available. "Now leave my sight," she said. "You have no power here anymore." Thomas had signaled. The staff had come. She had not watched Julian leave. She had not watched him, because there was nothing in his leaving that required her attention. She had said what she came to say, and it was said, and what happened with it was no longer her concern. She had turned. Thomas was looking at her with the quality she had been noting and examining, and had finally examined, and had understood, and that she was receiving now with the specific full quality of someone who was not managing it at a distance. "All right," he said. She had found, in the specific moment of the question, that it was both the simplest and the most complete thing anyone had said to her in a very long time. "Yes," she said, she was. The carriage that afternoon had the specific quality of ordinary things being extraordinary because of the context in which you were experiencing them. She was in a carriage. Thomas was beside her. She was going to the townhouse in Mayfair, which was hers. The city moved past the windows with the quality that cities had when you were inside something warm and moving through them. The specific quality of outside being outside, and inside being inside, and the inside being, for the first time in a long time, entirely the right place to be. She looked at the window. She thought about 22-year-old Vivian, who had said yes for the right reasons, and who had not known what she was walking into. She thought about 27-year-old Vivian, who had understood what she was inside, and had begun to plan. She thought about the library, and the traveling suit, and the papers placed in front of a man who had not read them. She thought about October, and the specific attending quality of a man who asked the right questions. She thought about the phrase she had heard 17 times. "You were a penniless girl from a ruined house." She was not penniless. She had never been penniless in the way he had meant it. She had been without money, which was a circumstance, and he had treated it as an identity, which was the specific cruelty of the specific kind of man who understood that confusing circumstances with identity was the most efficient form of control. She was not without money now. She was not without anything now. She had her properties and her townhouse, and her cousin Eleanor, and the specific accumulating warmth of the months since October. She had Thomas beside her, looking out the other window with the quality he had when he was not watching her, which was the quality of a man who was also thinking, who had his own interior accounting running, who was a person with his own history and his own weight and his own ongoing presence. She looked at him. He looked at her. She had the specific question she had been meaning to ask for some time, which she had been not asking, because the not asking was the care she was bringing to the pace of the thing. She understood, in the carriage, that the pace was right now. "Tell me," she said, "about the second visit." He was quiet for a moment. "You were explaining the land deed structure," he said, "the specific mechanism by which the bankruptcy transfer had been made to look complete when it was not." He looked at his hands. "You were going through the documents with the quality of someone who had been thinking about them for longer than the time you had officially had access to them." She had been thinking about them. She had been thinking about them since the early years of the marriage, when she had understood the shape of her situation and had begun, quietly, to research the legal history of her family's estate. "You said," he said, "that the specific clause was likely located on page 14 of the 1847 conveyance record, because the conveyancing solicitor of that period had a consistent practice of placing liability-limiting clauses in the third section of the 14th page." He looked up. "You were right. It was on page 14. She remembered this. "I understood," he said, "that I was sitting across from a woman who had been doing this work alone, in a situation that was designed to make independent thinking difficult, for years." He looked at her with the attending quality. "I understood that what you had done was extraordinary. And I understood that you were the kind of person I had been looking for without knowing I was looking for it." She sat with this. "In the professional sense," he said, carefully, "I recognized a mind I respected." A pause. "And in the other sense," he said, "I recognized someone I wanted to know." She looked at the window. The city continued. She thought about the specific quality of being known, not the knowing of someone who had acquired her, the knowing of someone who was paying attention, who had noticed page 14 and what it meant, who had asked the right questions and had received the answers and had found the answers worth finding. She was 32 years old and she was in a carriage in London with a man who had asked the right questions and who was looking at her with the quality of someone who intended to continue asking them for a considerable time. She was going home. She was going to the townhouse in Mayfair, which was hers, which was small and well-proportioned, and had the light coming through the windows at the angles that made rooms feel inhabited. She was going home. She reached across the space between them. She took his hand. He held it with the specific quality of someone receiving something they were going to take care of. The city moved past the windows. She was in it. She was going forward. Tell me in the comments, which moment stayed with you? Was it the traveling suit and the library, the papers he signed without reading, the empty room he came back to, the park in Mayfair, or the carriage and the question about the second visit? Drop it below. I want to know what you're carrying from this one. And tell me where you're watching from, your city, your country. Let me know who is in the room tonight. Subscribe and hit the bell, because the next story opens with a woman who discovers, on the morning of her 40th birthday, a package she did not order, containing the diary she lost at 19, and the last entry was written by someone else. I'll see you there.